Hello, this is Morgan Freeman, and I want to thank you so much for all the ways that you support my friends on The Edge with Mark Thompson. You know, you can listen on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, iHeartRadio, and many places that great podcasts are heard. That's an oxymoron, by the way, great podcasts. Or you can go to their website, edge-show.com. Well, still haven't purchased a new domain name, I see.
You're listening to The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Wherever you are listening, wherever we find you, I have a big fat episode with Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, but man, this does suck. I'm thinking of all of you, the crew that has come here for years now. I'm so grateful that we get a chance at least to touch base and for me to tell you that I care about your health. I really want us all to emerge on the other side of this pandemic crisis in one piece. We have some word about COVID-19, a couple of facts that you might find interesting as I talk with J Elvis Weinstein, the original voice of Servo on Mystery Science Theater, and regular listeners to this podcast know him. Then it's two Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, David Cay Johnston and Phillip Rucker. Not going to ask you for money, not going to ask you for anything, just hoping that we all get through this in one piece. Let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage it means.
Hey, look, I just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
J Elvis Weinstein, you and I oftentimes start the show or run the whole show together, and I love you as a continuing contributor or co-host or whatever you are. Some weeks you're not here, but when you're not, I really notice it, and so that's my long way of saying I'm really glad that in this time of forced separation, we're able to visit by phone. So thank you.
Well, thank you. That was very, very nice. It's always a pleasure in person or telephonically.
So are you sheltering in place, or what do they call it, safe at home right now? You're where do we find you?
I am safe at home with my wife. Luckily, we like each other. And,
do you think that relationships are going to be stressed in ways that I'm not suggesting that's the most important thing. Believe me, I understand
I absolutely think this will spark both a divorce and birth rate.
Oh, that's a good point. You don't hear much about the divorce rate. You hear about the birth rate. No one wants to talk about the ugly underbelly of all of this.
That's right.
Because there's such an ugly overbelly of all of this.
I believe that, the divorce lawyer sector will come back quickly. And I imagine the home improvement sector will come back fairly quickly.
And you can improve my home by getting rid of my spouse.
Exactly. One fell swoop.
The news
is you're in your rental or your
temporary residence, because my residence was burned, not burned down, but burned to the point that it's been damaged substantially. So it has to be repaired. Among those things that need to be repaired, the roof, which is a huge job, and now the insurance company can't agree on the number, and so that's really turning into a huge delay.
So work has not begun on your home?
No. They can't even reach an agreement on the number. And it's really it's a mess. And now, with the COVID-19 outbreak, I can't even get a hold of some of the city authorities and others that are involved in putting together some of the elements I need to put together to even do some of the repair work that's got to get done up there. I'm talking about, like, as I said, the roof is damaged. So now when it rains, and we've had some pretty good rains, there is water coming into the house. And so you got to get a remediation crew back up there again. This is after they've finished remediating once. It's difficult. And I have to get some of these, there are components of this whole thing that involve the city, and I can't even get a hold of those people now because of this coronavirus outbreak. So I'm not, it sucks pretty much.
So what you're saying is things are the worst for you.
Thank you. Exactly.
Okay, good.
I mean, I don't really know what to be scared of the most. but I'm absolutely petrified of everything. And you can say, well, I'm really more worried than petrified. Okay, petrified might overstate it, but I'm really, really worried, and I'm worried about my parents who are 90, and they live in Washington, D.C.
I have a lung-compromised 88-year-old mother-in-law that we're certainly worried about.
Where does she live?
She lives in Calabasas.
I'm asking because, it's so early to tell, but I'm just looking at hot zones. Like New York, when we're recording this at this instant, is a hot zone. California is a hot zone. But that's just, when we say a hot zone, that just means they've tested more people there. We really don't know where this virus is because even people who are symptomatic are not being tested in many parts of the country because there just aren't enough tests out there.
Right. My nephew was tested like 7 days ago or something, and he still hasn't gotten results.
I mean, here's the reality, though, J Elvis, that regardless of whether or not you're tested, your treatment is pretty much the same. I mean, what they can
unless you require hospitalization, you're being sent home and to quarantine. So
I mean, unless you just want to help with the epidemiology of it, which is something that's important. So the quarantine thing is important. You don't want to give it to other people. The test doesn't tell you anything in terms of your ability to treat yourself in a different way.
Right.
I noticed that ibuprofen, I guess, is not the recommended pain reliever or even fever reliever that it normally would be in a lot of other situations. Apparently, it makes the symptoms worse in many cases. I saw.
I've heard that part of the virus is causing inflammation of the heart and lungs, which is counterintuitive to not taking anti-inflammatories. But as someone who's kidney compromised, I can't take ibuprofen anyway. But I've always heard acetaminophen is better for fevers.
That's a great point, though, that it's an inflammatory virus, or that it's when a virus enters the body, the inflammatory chemicals go everywhere. They jack up your body's temperature and they cause a lot of inflammation in the body. And so you'd think an anti-inflammatory would help with that. But apparently Advil is, what do they say, contraindicated? So they go Tylenol. In fact, I saw a last thing on this, just trying to give you some news you can use.
Thank you. You're tapped into the live radio.
Yes.
World.
When you have a fever, the French health minister recommended treating the COVID-19 fever with Tylenol or any other drug that includes the ingredient acetaminophen. There have been serious adverse events, says the French health minister, related to the use of all non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications, including ibuprofen, in patients with COVID-19. Then, after he said that, the UK's health agency came out with its own statement, and they said there is currently no strong evidence that ibuprofen can make coronavirus COVID-19 worse. But until we have more information, take acetaminophen to treat the symptoms of coronavirus unless your doctor has told you that's not suitable for you. So, anyway, just hang on tight.
But don't pump yourself with acetaminophen. Look at those. I think I don't quote me on this, but there is an upper limit, which I think is around 2,000 milligrams in a 24-hour period because acetaminophen messes with your liver.
Oh, wow. Well, I'll tell you something else. There's a long-standing debate as to whether or not you should even treat fever, that you shouldn't try to bring your fever down. And I was reading some articles in relation to that back and forth. The idea is that the fever is the body's natural way of treating an intruder. I feel very intruded upon now these days.
Yeah, it's, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sitting here. I'm more like, it's more of a sense of wonder is a little too positive, but amazement at just, when you are in the middle of what will be world history. It's quite a view.
There's a potential shortage of cotton swabs. Did you see that? Like just even our ability to swab the relevant area and then put it onto a specimen form and then send it. That is something we're deficient in. Those swabs. That along with all the protective clothing that healthcare workers have to wear. I mean, you just see how woefully inadequate the system is to treat any kind of pandemic like this in this country.
Yeah, and it's compounded by woefully inadequate leadership.
Of course.
Which makes it incredibly difficult to lower anxiety.
I had a story that I was going to ask you about because I thought it was so weird. There are all these stories that relate to the coronavirus that are not necessarily all about, getting tested and shortages and that kind of thing. And one of them is this guy who goes out on a rafting trip, and it's a group of people. There, I think more than a dozen people that go out on this rafting trip, and it's a 25-day adventure. They say, and they have no communication with the outside world, and they left before the news of this coronavirus came up, and when they come back, they came back to this.
There was the cast of Big Brother in Germany was in the same situation, apparently.
Is that right? I didn't know.
Yes.
When they pulled their rafts out of the Colorado, they were met by a man named Blaine, who worked for a rafting company out of Flagstaff, Arizona. He had one question for them. Have you been in contact with the outside world? They hadn't, aside from a few one-way text messages sent to family on a satellite phone. No cell service, no news.
Get back on the river.
Half of us thought he was joking as he told us about the coronavirus. Like, here's an old river guide pulling our leg. I mean, I've heard some pretty big tales out on the river.
Yeah, I would go for a second source myself, probably.
Just a wild story. All these shows in Hollywood have shut down, and all the shows everywhere have shut down. Canada, Hollywood. I'm just using Hollywood in sort of a generic sense. TV series, films, production stopped.
Yeah, it's going to be a weird second half of the year, entertainment-wise.
I think it's going to be a weird second half of the year every which way. I mean, look at the small business owners.
And frankly, we'll all be tired of watching TV by then anyway.
I'm really hoping we get to the second half of the year. I have to say, though, that the small business owners, I feel for them. I mean, I know big business as a lobby. I mean, you see the hotel industry and most of the leisure industry, they are able to lobby in Washington effectively. They have relationships. Trump himself comes out of the hospitality business.
Right.
So the hospitality business has lobbyists in Washington, and they almost don't need it. They have a connection to the president. And so do the Boeing executives who, Mark Esper is a defense contractor, ex-defense, he's the Department of Defense head. And I just kind of feel like, so when Boeing is petitioning for money and when these hotel chains are and the cruise ships, these are likely areas that are going to see a lot of money dumped on them. But the small businesses, they don't have that kind of clout.
No, they don't. They only have, the goodwill of their representatives in Congress and much tighter margins,
Right, exactly. I mean, they're really living, some of these small business people, they're the ones living paycheck to paycheck. Now, they're going to suspend, mortgage demands and all the rest, but I just don't know how I really feel for these people in making ends meet.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, because even, suspending them helps in the short term, but ultimately that becomes debt, It's not like they aren't forgiving the mortgage payments, they're just suspending them.
Yeah. You saw that there are now 4 senators involved in these stock sales, and they dumped this stock.
I did see that.
Yeah. They dumped
Senator... Apparently Feinstein is the only one who has a true blind trust.
Yeah. And there can be some questions about Feinstein and her husband particularly, but you're right. On this issue, it would appear that's the case. This guy, Richard Burr, he's the intelligence chair.
Yeah.
And he sold off this stock around the time that he was receiving daily briefings on the health threat. His biggest sale included companies that are among the most vulnerable. He dumped $150,000 worth of shares in Wyndham Hotels, and that's a chain that's lost 2/3 of its value. He sold up to $100,000 of shares in Extended Stay America. I mean, this guy seems as dirty as they get.
By the way, investing in Extended Stay America is the closest thing to being a slumlord. You can be in the stock market, I'm pretty sure.
So all of that's going on. The swamp continues. When you talk about the lack of an administrative strategy that makes sense, and you talk about blind spots when it comes to administering to this health crisis from this administration, you really have to look at the books, the writing, and the journalism out of the guests on today's show. One is David Cay Johnston. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author and investigative reporter. He's reported on Donald Trump's real estate, on his taxes. He's reported on a lot of the swamp, not just Donald Trump, predated Donald Trump. But he's done a biography of Trump that is truly revelatory. I mean, you just realize how little Trump is interested in anything. And now here he is facing this huge wave that's crashing on top of him. And you just wish he would get out of the way and let the professionals, I'm talking about the health professionals, make a lot of these strategic decisions,
Yeah, and we don't need the daily briefing on how the epidemic is making him look.
Yeah. I feel for Fauci and the woman, is it Deborah Bricks, the other doctor up there? I mean, they're having to stand there and listen to these things. Why can't we get more tests? I get it. But the deficiencies, I think, have been laid bare. I'm not saying that we shouldn't ask about them, but I mean, once they've been asked once, I don't think we need to retill that soil. Everybody's trying to get on television now, is what I think.
Yeah, absolutely. No, everyone is trying to be a viral clip in the world.
I'm just over it. So these conversations with Donald Trump and his crew, and by the way, if there's a gold medal for ass kissing, Mike Pence will win it every hour.
Oh, man.
It's amazing. It's almost obnoxious where every statement has to start with, and thanks to the president's fine judgment on, and thanks to the president's mandate on, or it has to end with, so we're grateful to the president for.
Yeah, it is positively North Korean.
Yeah, it's North Korean. I think it's also something coming natural to him because he's a supplicant. You know, he's a born again. He really believes that. And when you're constantly professing your faith in the Lord at every turn, that's the way it is. And you're giving thanks all the time to the Lord, and you use a reference to the Lord by name. I think that's a plug-and-play move for you.
Right. That sets you up as a beta.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it can all be justified in the name of a greater good, you know.
Right.
So on today's show, I've got David Cay Johnston and Phillip Rucker. It's a real big chunk of Trump. But if you want to pull back the curtain on this administration, these guys really do it in ways that, first of all, Rucker's an amazing investigative reporter. Again, Pulitzer Prize winner. And so is Johnston, Pulitzer Prize winner. And the reporting, the investigative heavy lifting is so impressive. These are all sourced and corroborated stories and facts about this administration and beyond. And I think it's important because, as J Elvis says, you know, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the ineptness of this administration, and we're dealing with the pandering of this administration and the links to big business of this administration above the common man. Now, that said, I don't think everything they're doing is bad. They're doing some things that could be good. But I'm just saying that, are they?
No, I think they are. I just think that, you know, clearly hubris was a big issue at the beginning of this thing that slowed down the necessary response, you know.
And, you know, it was aided and abetted by Fox News Channel, which is really a loop that Donald Trump pays a lot of attention to. You know, Sean Hannity. Can I play you something, J Elvis? This is Sean Hannity. This is 12 days ago.
They're scaring the living hell out of people, and I see it again as like, oh, let's bludgeon Trump with this new hoax.
That is on March 8th. If you're listening to this, March 8th. So that was 12 days ago as we record this?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. March 8th, he's saying it. It's a hoax. And that's what Trump was saying. It's a hoax. It's a Democratic hoax.
Kind of laugh at it, but nothing to laugh at here. By the way, this program has always taken the coronavirus seriously, and we've never called the virus a hoax. We call what they're doing, trying to bludgeon the president out. Their politicizing of this virus, well, predictable, despicable, repulsive, all of the above.
Yeah, the truth is he did say hoax, of course.
Oh, let's bludgeon Trump with this new hoax.
Yeah,
and more to the point, you know, J Elvis, he's like an advisor to the president. He talks to the president all the time. He may as well do his show from the Oval Office.
No, absolutely. It goes back, and like you said, they pass it back and forth like a virus.
Yeah. So anyway, I feel as though that delay, not taking it seriously, it reminds me a bit, as we're finding out more and more, it reminds me a bit of 9/11, how there were reports of this plan to fly planes into the World Trade Center. They specifically outlined in various reports from the FBI that this was going on. And those reports, because of an inability of the administration to interlock with the intelligence arm of the FBI, those reports went unheeded. So anyway, in this case, this pandemic was warned about in December. And in January, a pulmonologist in Southern California was telling me, hey, you know, this thing in China, I think it could be a big deal. We hadn't heard anything about it. And then, I mean, anything on the, you know, that it was going to be a worldwide pandemic. And then, of course, the denials continue, as I played you that Sean Hannity, through March 8th. And by then, it's way late. So I'm concerned for sure. So Merry Christmas.
I don't think you're Chicken Littling it here.
Yeah. I would say one last thing.
Okay.
The relationship we have with animals on this planet is screwed up. And the extension of that is those wet markets in China. And the idea that you can have these exotic animals or even non-exotic animals. As you know, they have a dog and cat trade there, and they'll boil live animals for you right there at your table. And it's considered a delicacy. It's considered exotic because they feel the adrenaline that goes through the animal is going into you. It's a virility thing. So this is so out of whack. And you know how I feel about the way we dominate the animal kingdom already. But I'm just saying, J Elvis, these wet markets, they are where these SARS illnesses are emerging. They come right out of that world.
Yes, whenever you're forming a new human-animal biological link, a bat can have a butterfly effect.
Right. God, you're good. The bat can have a butterfly effect. I love that. That's why you're a writer.
That's it. An out-of-work one, but I'm healthy.
Well, everybody's out of work if you want to feel better.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. Your Twitter feed is funny all the time. What is the consistent stuff during this time when everything's so dire that gets a laugh? But I always feel like, gallows humor might be tricky, but not for you, really?
Not really. I mean, I'm wired for it, both as a Jew and as my particular family. Everything has always been funny and serious simultaneously,
Yeah, I guess that's true, huh? Wow. Well, what are you doing for the pandemic this weekend? You're working on stuff? You're editing a movie?
I have to go drop off a hard drive tomorrow. I think I'm going to not work. I'm going to just give the guy notes, and then I'm pretty much out of work. I have no more tasks left for the pandemic.
Well, don't forget to wash your hands after you drop off the hard drive.
I will not, and I'm even going to wipe it. I'm going to do a wipe of it before I hand it to him too.
At my home, I don't know if I'm supposed to wipe down like the grocery bag. Like the guy at the grocery store, first of all, people are handling all the grocery stuff. It's not like you're the first person to touch that. And secondly, the guy at the grocery store who's, wanding everything or whatever, he's touching each and everything. So do I need to wipe everything down?
I think you should, certainly wash off produce real good. And I think you should, I don't think you need to wipe everything down. You just need to wash your hands and not touch your face.
Okay. All right. Can you keep this line open so I can call you for situational questions I might have?
Absolutely. Consider me on call.
About what to wash? Yeah. J Elvis, we love you, and I need us both alive at the end of this, if we could.
I'm with you 100%.
There will be an end to this, right?
I really believe there will be, yes.
J Elvis, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Stay healthy.
You too.
Hi, how are you? It's Arnold Schwarzenegger. I want to thank you for supporting Mark Thompson here on the Edge Radio. Fantastic show with all the jokes and J Elvis, and all the commentary and the politics and the bullshit. You can listen to this little pageant on iTunes or Stitcher. The hell is that? They're just making all this shit up. Or you can just go to the damn website, edge-show.com.
David Cay Johnston, what a cool thing to have you join us here. You've met my cohort here, J Elvis Weinstein.
Hello.
Hello, Josh.
You're a Pulitzer Prize winner, and you've done investigative journalism for so long. You know the Trump brand, and you know where the bodies are buried on Donald Trump in ways that I think very few other people do. In your book, you discuss, and you've done, how many books? I'm thinking of the Making of Donald Trump is the book I'm thinking of. But you've done...
Well, that's a biography, and then I did... It's even worse than you think what the Trump administration is doing to America after he took office. And then about half of my 1992 expose of the casino industry, Temples of Chance, was about Donald.
Oh, so I'm behind on my David Cay Johnston books. But one of the things you talk about is so germane to what's going on now. And that is we're facing this health crisis. And he gets out, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, and essentially starts making a bunch of pronouncements about this thing that he knows nothing about. And his administration sort of tries to fall in line with what he's saying, knowing it would seem that what he's saying is not accurate. You make the point in your book, again, the one book that I'm familiar with, that he really, even in the case of his many businesses, doesn't know a lot about a lot of stuff. So he's working from a position of general ignorance ignorance on most issues, certainly in the case of this health crisis.
Yeah, this is a real problem because finally, after 3 years, Donald Trump's confronted with an actual crisis, and you're seeing that he has no idea what to do. He was on television. He went up to the Capitol and was stopped by reporters in the hall, and he was asked, well, have you gotten yourself tested? Because he's been around people who are now self-quarantining, including 7 members of Congress. And he said, no, I feel great. I feel great. No reason for me to be tested. I'm healthy. When you're in the incubation stage, of course you feel great. He doesn't understand this. He earlier said to people on his staff and who had come to the White House from other agencies, well, we don't have a virus for this yet, but we can give people the flu vaccines we have now, and that'll help some, right? No. I mean, his ignorance here is just beyond belief. And this virus we are seeing is incredibly infectious. And look at what the Chinese have had to do. 930 million people in a country of about 1.5 billion now are on some kind of very restricted movement. They can't leave. Only one person in the family can leave their apartment. They can only leave it like once a week to go buy food. You can't go anywhere. The Chinese have been successful, however, in lowering the spread of the disease from, for each known case, at one point almost 4 new cases. They're now down to, for each known case, about 0.4% of a case. That's a 90% drop, effectively. In Italy, they've locked down most of the country, and those are what the things are going to be needed if you want to stop the spread of this virus. With this administration, what's its response? We need a tax cut. The solution to every problem is we need a tax cut.
Well, they're responding, of course, to the markets only, right? That's really what got his attention, it would seem. The first time he really showed up on the bridge of this ship was when the Dow was tanking.
That's right, and they are being petitioned by the fossil fuel industries for subsidies, which they've indicated they are inclined to seek from Congress to give subsidies to coal and oil and pipeline companies. I mean, it's going to be a real economic disaster, but it's the people who live paycheck to paycheck, the people who can't come up with $400 in an emergency for, say their transmission in their car. It's a lot more than $400.
He's going to send all them. He's going to send
need
them
help, and we need to tell people. One of the smartest things we could do right now is to adopt a policy that if you don't have paid sick leave, and millions of people don't, and you have any symptoms or been around someone, we'll pay you your wage to stay home, because it will slow the spread of the disease, it will save lives, and it will save money in the long run. But this administration, they don't. The people who knew this and who were appointed to do this under the Obama administration. He created a national security team in the White House for the next pandemic. They were all dismissed.
Yeah, they were viewed as Obama holdovers. And and
anything that Obama proposed, Mark, is to Donald Trump, that makes it bad per se,
right. Yeah.
Which just goes to his childishness and his weakness in terms of ego. But they are not effectively responding to this and doing things like attacking Governor Jay Inslee of Washington, who is in fact a highly competent governor, as he was a prosecutor and a smart congressman, and calling him a snake. This isn't helpful. This doesn't deal with anything but Donald's ego.
Well, I feel as though that's
what all this is about. It's about him.
Right. The playing field of calling people names and playing the politics of it, the marketing of it, the messaging of situations, it works well on the campaign trail.
Right. But he's he's trying to switch gears completely from stoking irrational fear to now stoking irrational calm.
Right.
And it doesn't work.
We just be calm. It'll go away. When it gets warm, it'll go away. Because Donald does not get science in any way. He claimed during the campaign that everything you need to know about nuclear missiles he could learn in 30 minutes, and he knew more than the generals about ISIS.
Yeah, the only law of science is his hunch. That's the only immutable law.
Josh, that's a great line. The only law of science is Donald's hunch. Yes, great line.
Yeah, look, his lack of knowledge seems manifest, and you've documented it in many of your writings. The interesting thing that you allude to is something that you wrote a book about, which is the way that the super rich or the wealthiest Americans enrich themselves at the expense of those who are not the wealthiest Americans.
Right.
And
right. We actually did a whole trilogy of that. One on taxes, one on subsidies that nobody knew about then, and everybody now knows about, all this welfare to corporations, and then ways that corporations get the government to reduce or eliminate competition, the rise of monopolies and duopolies. And this is still one of the great stories that I think is shaping what's happening in the country. You see all these surveys showing that millennials reject capitalism. Well, that's not surprising because we don't have capitalism in America. What we have in America is corporate socialism, where there's some competition and business activity, but we have these massive hidden subsidies on just the state and local level. Forget the federal government, just the state and local level. The average family of four in America is burdened by $900 a year in subsidies to corporations like General Electric and Google and Boeing and others. That's more than the average take-home weekly pay for a family of four in America, $900. So basically 1 week's take-home paycheck you're giving over to these companies, Walmart, Home Depot, Cabela's, Goldman Sachs, Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, all big beneficiaries of these policies. And, of course, young people are disillusioned about that. They understand that something's happened here and we have rigged the game. And it's the reason we need to have fundamental campaign finance reform. The reforms that were put in after Watergate, and I wrote about them back then, that were supposed to clean up politics have backfired, and they have given a narrow group of very wealthy people an enormous hold over our economy. And I will tell you, as someone who was the co-founder of a little small business, when I teach economics classes and law classes, I say competition's a good thing. Here's why. My books champion competitive markets. When you're running a business, the worst possible thing in the world is more competition because it narrows your profit margins and requires you to be smarter and smarter. And the big businesses in this country, they don't want competition. They want to limit competition. And they've, under this administration, been getting rules and regulations rewritten and redone or withdrawn that help them avoid the rigors of a competitive market. So, yeah, surprise, surprise. Young people have looked at this and said, I may not understand exactly what's going on, but I don't like it.
Well, I feel as though the curtain has been pulled back on the absurdity of the election process being driven by big money, right? I mean, and being candidates beholden to that big money. Yeah.
And every member I've interviewed over the years, it's been years since I've interviewed them about this, but in the 90s and the early part of the century, I interviewed over 100 members of Congress and senators about campaign finance. And the story was the same. Didn't matter if you were a conservative Republican or a progressive Democrat, a union person, an anti-union person. Every one of them felt the whole process was humiliating. And when I would say to them, well, then why don't you support legislation to change it? They were all what economists call risk averse. Well, I know this system. I don't know what will happen if we have a new system. And the only way we're going to get change is the public's going to have to rise up and demand it. Every major reform in the history of this country, the end of slavery, women getting the right to vote, getting child labor laws, the environmental laws that Nixon signed, all came about because the public demanded it and made it clear that if you were a politician and didn't do this, your career was going to come to an end.
I'm glad you give those examples because I was about to say, well, the people's voice has been stifled by that same big money that you're saying they should, rise up against. But you just cited examples through which at least I can see a path maybe to making enough noise to change a bit of the system. It does feel overwhelming, Dave. It feels like it's going the other way.
It is. I mean, this is a much better financed opposition to real reform than we've ever had. And the other thing is things take time. From the Seneca Falls Convention that women held in 1848, it took 72 years for women to get the right to vote.
The reason I love that example is women actually overturning an existing system that prevented them from voting when they didn't have the vote. I mean, in other words, their voice was already being suppressed, right, Josh?
It was 100% persuasion.
Exactly.
That was their task ahead of them.
Right. They had no legal voice in a way, and they made it happen.
They found enough men over time who were willing to grant women the right to vote. But that took, 72 years, a really, really long time. On the other hand, the U.S. Supreme Court, unanimous decision in Brown versus Board of Education on segregated schools, 1954. Our schools are pretty much as segregated today as they were then. California, the Serrano versus Priest case about a child in one of the East L.A. communities, Boyle Heights or somewhere around there, and getting an inferior education, despite the California State Constitution saying the first duty of the state and the first call on its money is education. The kid in Serrano has been on Medicare now for about a decade, and nothing's changed. It's hard to make change. Society resists change, and it takes determination and leadership. That's why Occupy failed. They said, we reject leaders. Well, your movement failed. It takes leadership, and it takes patience, and it takes determination.
It's funny you mentioned Occupy. I feel as though they had their moment. In other words, they had a moment for a moment, and it seemed to me there was going to go momentum. I understand there was a problem with clarity of message and a clarity of demand,
But was that Seneca Falls? Was that, what is the equivalent of Seneca Falls in the campaign finance? And
I don't think we've seen it yet in campaign finance, Josh. I think that's a very good question. When Occupy started, I was at that point the global economics columnist for Reuters, and I called up both editors and news site people in New York, and I said, this demonstration is unlike any other I'm just watching it on TV from my home in Rochester, New York. I said, this isn't like any demonstration I've seen. The people I'm seeing being interviewed on cable and whatnot are such a mix. You need to get down there with someone who understands demonstrations. They said, well, you get down. So I got on the plane and I went down there, and it was exactly what I thought. I was stunned to see people who worked on Wall Street or whose spouses did were among the demonstrators. And there were truck drivers and physicians. It was a whole mix of people who were really angry about how we've allowed the financialization and securitization of everything instead of understanding that finance should be what makes the economy go, but it's just the fuel. It is not the economy itself. And it was really unfortunate that they rejected this notion of leadership because nothing came of it. Now, we've had some big successes. Look at Elizabeth Warren's Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. It's returned to people who were ripped off by banks about $4 for every dollar it's cost to run it. This week we had a hearing in Washington where Katie Porter, this incredibly smart law professor from UC Irvine who got elected to Congress, says to the CEO of Wells Fargo, $600 million that you stole from your customers, how much have you paid back? Well, I don't know. She says, well, let me show you a chart here. It's zero. So I want to know, will you pledge now to return this money? And he waffles. We've created a society where you can steal from your customers hundreds of millions of dollars, and instead of saying, yeah, we're going to do, he'll say we're going to do the right thing, but they haven't returned any money and they're fighting in court not to return it. This is a real moral breakdown at the top, and we have to get away from this idea that the purpose of our country is to make you rich. You go read your Constitution. There's not a word in there about making people rich. If that's the purpose of the country, we are doomed. The purpose of our country was written down for us in the preamble, and I would summarize what all of it says as it is to ennoble the human spirit to see what a free people can achieve. And if all we're going to achieve is rich people getting richer, people who own corporate jets buying jumbo jets like the gambling guy in Vegas owns Adelson.
Oh, Adelson, yeah.
He owns
Sheldon
two
Adelson.
personal 747s, one for himself, one for his wife. One of them is equipped for skateboarding in the sky by their youngest heirs.
Oh, my God. That's unbelievably decadent. Yeah. I can't believe it.
Yeah, and who needs a personal 747? If that's the purpose of our country, we're doomed. We have to get back to the fact the purpose of this country is to establish justice, to promote the general welfare, provide for the common defense. Those are the purposes of our country, and to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. And we're living too much in, we got to have this today. Don't worry about tomorrow. I just wrote a piece it's a DC report, the news service that I and others co-founded, about if you think the coronavirus is scary, read what we're going to tell you that nobody else has reported about Trump's budget and health. He wants to completely wipe out the program that connects local and state health officials with one another, sponsors conferences and things so they can know each other, be in contact with each other. $8.2 million a year.
No, it's nothing. It's nothing. Yeah.
It's nothing in the federal budget. He wanted, the first year he came in, to cut the National Institutes of Health budget by 23%. His current proposal is 7%. Now, the budget's actually gone up because Congress wouldn't go along with him. He wants to cut spending on the Centers for Disease Control. And, of course, they're telling scientists you can't put various scientific information in your reports because it offends Donald Trump's imaginary world out there. And, I mean, I hope people read this at DC Report because it hasn't been in the mainstream media, and people have little idea that he isn't just unaware of science. His administration is actively suppressing science, is hostile to it. They want to cut not just climate research that you've heard about, but virtually all kinds of science except for building bigger, better, more deadly weapons.
It's dcreport.org, and I will link to it wherever you're listening to this. If you're on the iTunes platform, it'll be there in the description. And if you're at our parent website, edge-show.com, there'll be a hot link to DC Report. Singular.org. I want to go back and talk about the wealthiest because you touched on it and mergers that were allowed to occur, et cetera. But because we're on this other thing now, I want to go back to Donald Trump and sort of the shallowness of his understanding. And I want to ask you, from a practical standpoint, the cuts you're talking about, the cuts to CDC, the new budget cuts, where are they coming from? I can't believe that he even has the patience to sit down and suggest these and look at a budget. He doesn't care. He wants to go golf.
No. That's exactly right. It's the team Trump brought in with him. Steve Bannon, who was his strategic advisor in the campaign, said that if elected, their goal was going to be to destroy the federal government.
Yeah, they called it the administrative state, right?
That's right. And that's just code for we want to destroy the federal government. I mean, we still don't have ambassadors in many countries around the world. He's just never done it. So in my book, It's Even Worse Than You Think, where I go into what they're doing to the government, things like taking a top federal manager and literally turning him into a $150,000 a year clerk processing checks because he wouldn't resign. I call the people who are doing this work political termites because you never hear their names. They are operating like termites unseen between the walls of your house, but they are eating away at the structure of our government. And they have forced out many, many scientists. The guy who kept his job by becoming a clerk is the exception of someone who just, I will not submit and I will not run away. But, there's this blatant effort to clean out the agriculture department of economists and scientists by moving its headquarters to Kansas from Washington, D.C. It won't save any money at all. It's designed to get rid of people who do real work.
Right. They want those people to resign, So we're going to make their life so awful.
And then Trump goes around saying, we have 17 intelligence agencies. We spend, by the narrowest count, $1 billion a week on intelligence. And the president doesn't take his intelligence briefings. They tried for a while to do them for him, with drawings and video and stuff, because he's in the classic meaning of the word a moron.
Right.
And he just doesn't even take these things because he doesn't understand these things about the world. And a good example of this is it doesn't matter to most people listening to this podcast or to the three of us, the difference between a Sunni Muslim and a Shia Muslim. But if you're the president of the United States, this is an incredibly important issue because you can't understand the tension between the murderous royal kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where they 3 years ago beheaded 40 people for the crime of praying for a better government, versus the autocratic regime run by the mullahs in Tehran, who are seen by the Saudis as a terrible threat to their security because they at least claim that they're in favor of having democratic institutions. If you don't know a Sunni from a Shia, you can't make smart decisions on a geopolitical level. And Trump doesn't know any of this, and it doesn't mean anything to him. He has no sense of history about these things. Remember, this is the man who thought Frederick Douglass, who's buried a couple of miles from where I'm talking to you right now, was getting more and more popular.
Right.
Yeah.
He literally doesn't know.
He's only been buried now for about 110 years.
He literally doesn't know Shiite from Shinola. So.
Oh,
exactly.
Josh, see?
Another score, Josh.
See, David, he waits like an assassin on the roof. Yeah. So, everything you say provokes another question. So just because we're on foreign policy a bit, do you feel as though, because you really do know a lot about where the bodies are buried, he gets his foreign policy strategies following the money, talking about the moneyed Saudi interests in this case?
Yeah.
Or
Well, I think there's a lot of influence there. I mean, Trump is working very hard to hide his finances. And we know by his own account that the Saudis have put a lot of money in his pocket. We know by his son's account and other public records that the Russians have put a great deal of money in his pockets. I think it's beyond question that he's been heavily involved for years in money laundering activities. And that deeply influences his thoughts. When he talked about North Korea, what was his first observation? Oh, it's got these beautiful beaches and mountains. We could build resorts there. It's the way he sees the world. And something very important is about to happen. On March 31st, our Supreme Court is going to hear oral argument on whether Donald Trump's business records and tax returns going back to 2011 can be obtained by a Manhattan grand jury that is investigating state income tax cheating by Trump. Now, it has been the law of this land since an 1807 ruling by written by Chief Justice John Marshall, that a president has no privileges or immunities for anything before he took office. Trump, in this case, has argued that not only should he be exempted and protected from anything he did when he was a private citizen, but his lawyer, George Consovoy, literally said in federal court that if Trump were to go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, NYPD homicide detectives could not investigate that crime.
He's operating under that assumption.
That's right. That's how dictators operate. That's how the royal family in Saudi Arabia that murdered the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi operate. That's how dictator Kim, who had his half-brother killed with poison on his face in an airport in, Singapore or Indonesia, operate. And to make that argument as an American president, it's astonishing to me. The courts so far have utterly rejected it. We'll see what happens at the U.S. Supreme Court. But no president should have privileges and immunities for things he did as a private citizen.
It strikes me as played out during his term that he's right about the assumption that I can do whatever I want, because oversight and restraint on the executive branch has been non-existent.
Yeah, I think the only things that have held Donald back are the fact that he's lazy. We know from the White House's own staff, he spends a lot of the day sitting there watching Fox, sometimes watching MSNBC, and worried
in
about
the private quarters. I mean, he sometimes doesn't show up, they say, until well after noon.
Yeah, and his schedule often lists almost nothing on it. Stephanie Grisham, who you and I pay for as the White House press secretary, but is really Trump's private emissary to Fox, said on Fox and Friends the other morning that this remarkable man who only sleeps 4 hours a night and works 15 or 16 hours every day. It's like, you're the press secretary and you have to make up stuff like this. And it's really troubling. I mean, this is how cults operate. Having exposed a few cults over the years, I was at the LA Times, and it's really disturbing to see this cult-like thinking.
Yeah, the dear leaderism is amazing.
There is a cult of personality around this guy. I mean, let's face it. You don't see this sort of fealty to a guy without there being on the part of the public, I would suggest that it's kind of cultism. On the part of politicians, it's about power.
Right, and I think that people have realized that the simple transaction of praising him will get them great riches, that because this man...
Well, it'll also, Josh, save their job. I mean, the fact is Trump does have among Republicans a 90% or so approval rating.
Right.
And so if you stand up to Trump as a Republican, you are likely to get primaried. Here's the part I don't get about that. If you're Jeff Flake, the Flakes are the first family of Arizona. They got a town named after them. They're the equivalent of first families of Virginia and Mayflower families in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. When he decided that he couldn't run again because he would be primaried, and he holds himself out as this deeply principled libertarian, he couldn't bring himself to say what, if you read between the lines, he thought, which is that Donald Trump is unqualified, unfit, should not be in this office.
Right.
And we just saw, I think it was 37 Republicans, one senator, a bunch of congressmen, and some cabinet secretaries and Kellyanne's husband file a brief with the Supreme Court that just mocks Trump and his claims that he's above the law. But there wasn't a single current office holder who had the courage to do that. More than 1 million people died for this country. My father was a 100% disabled veteran of World War II. And the elected politicians who know that Trump is bad for the country lack the courage to stand up and say what they're saying in private because they'll get voted out of office.
Right.
Profiles in cowardice.
Yeah, that's why I say it's about power, because they just don't want to lose that power. Josh,
Yep.
sorry.
Yeah, no, it goes back to, again, the money. You can't, if these jobs are that worth holding on to, then we're doomed.
Yeah.
Well, it's also more than the money, Josh. It's the power. I mean, people treat sitting U.S. senators the way they treat rock stars.
It's true, yeah.
And in every aspect of that.
No, I grew up in Washington, and it's not just money; it's access. You have a whole different life when you're a senator or a congressperson.
Yeah, years ago, I was having dinner in a hotel right on Capitol Hill, and at the next table were a bunch of young staffers, and one of them was going on and on about how the senator had taken a line from their memo and spoken it on the Senate floor, and everybody was like, "Oh, wow, that's been a long time since he's done that for me." It was like, wow, this is an interesting way of verifying your existence.
Oh, my father, when he would go to Safeway with him once in a while, my dad on the weekends, he'd take the kids in, and I would always, this is when I was a teenager, I'd always try to, in a loud voice, call to him, Senator. I go, Senator, do you want me to pick up some of this? And everybody in the store just turned. It was great. You realize the power of that title,
right.
because nobody knows what a senator looks like. Back then there was even less visibility on these guys. I want to go back for a moment and talk about, because you're talking about Sheldon Adelson, and you were kind of talking about that decadence and that ultra merged empire that Adelson has and others have. I feel as though that horse got out of the barn some time ago. I remember when they were talking about, they were trying to limit. Was it the Microsoft Netscape or whatever that used to come on the computer? Maybe it wasn't Netscape. It was
right. There was a fight early on over browsers and monopolizing browsers.
Thank you. And at the same time, they were allowing these media mergers, the old limitations on how much media you could own, how many television stations you could. That was going on at the same time. It was getting no publicity. I was screaming it from the rooftops. All they were talking about was this Microsoft thing. That began the media merged world that we live in now.
Well, first of all, let me tell you, I can go back and get clips for you that appeared in the Post and the Times and the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times, but they didn't catch any popular interest.
Yeah, maybe
in
it didn't, not to enough visibility. I guess what I get the point.
Right,
yeah.
And when the TV networks covered it was to announce what had happened after it was all over. And I don't expect most people to take a deep interest in these issues of antitrust and competition. What's happened is the idea that monopolies are good, oligopolies are good, competition is not as good, that the winner should take all, has grown up in the Chicago School of Economics. And I went to the Chicago School. I'm an apostate, literally at the University of Chicago in graduate school. And it has been terrible for the country. It has made us less prosperous overall, less efficient. It results in all sorts of negatives. And one of the things we most need is a restoration of competitive market capitalism of the kind that Adam Smith wrote about 250 years ago. But it is underlying this. So there's a whole series of ideas that came in when Ronald Reagan came along. We had the New Deal. We had almost no bank failures from the late 1930s up until the mid-1980s. The economy did quite well. People in the bottom 90% did quite well. And then we decided to change policies. And the policy change we made was done under a fundamental issue you can clearly see now looking back, and that was the reason America isn't doing even better is the rich don't have enough. They won't invest as much as they might in businesses, and we need to get more money to the rich. And the way we're going to get money to the rich is we're going to cut back on things like food stamps and public health. And this is a continuing issue to this day, and it's very focused on today, not tomorrow. We've cut enormously investments in basic science. Half the economic growth in this country since World War II can be attributed to taxpayer funding of basic science and applied science work. And we're cutting this left and right. This administration in particular is very hostile to it, but the Obama administration wasn't that big on it. George W. Bush wasn't that big on it. And there's a book out by two economists at MIT saying the number one way to restart the American economy is for the government to start spending a lot of money on basic science and then on adopting science to make it useful. And it's gone nowhere. Nobody's paying any attention to that argument.
Yeah, the remarkable thing, the magic trick that was done is to get all of us to somehow swallow that which you've just talked about, which is somehow the real help for the economy is to give these people who have a lot already even more so they can invest more in this economy.
Well, we keep innovating new opiates for the masses, too.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. More opiates for the masses. If Karl Marx had been born 150 years later, he would have said that commercial sports are the opiate of the masses, and look at all the subsidies we pour into, Major League Baseball and football and basketball and hockey.
I talk about this in relation to revolution. I get it once in a while when I'm doing my show. People go, we need in this country is revolution. I'm thinking, this country is, I get that we were born of revolution, but now that we have ESPN, I feel we'll never have revolution.
We've softened.
Yeah, we've softened.
Yeah, and I think that's revolutions, first of all, they occur when a large number of young men conclude that the future is worse than what they know today, and it's got to be really bad today. And we don't have those kind of conditions. What we really need is a revolution of involvement in citizenship. At DC Report, we tell people at our About page, our position is it's our government, we own it. Too many of us are acting like squatters or renters. Act like an owner. Remember that the President of the United States works for you. He's not your boss. He's your employee, no matter who's in the White House. And you've got to be engaged. We've seen civic engagement fall off as some major changes have taken place in our society. The unions dropping from more than a third of private sector workers down to around 5 or 6% now, because unions provided a voice for many people and a staff who could do these things. Shifting to a society with two-income households. It's had a drastic drop in things from everything from support for community organizations like programs for kids to having time to be involved in political and cultural matters, and the decline in church attendance of all kinds, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and other beliefs, has reduced by very substantially the social justice movements and the interfaith social justice movements in this country, so that these voices have been diminished and starved at the same time that the ideas promoted by the DeVos family, by the Koch brothers and others have gone through the roof because they have these incredible amounts of money that they can pour into promoting their agenda.
Yeah, that's just so well put. I mean, there's a naked capitalism or a nakedness to the capitalism now. And even when you talk about Sheldon Adelson, and you were referring to this plane that's got a bowling alley or whatever the hell it's got, a skateboard place.
Yeah, right. Skateboarding in the sky.
Right,
yeah.
Skateboarding in the sky. I guess a bowling alley would be tough to keep flat. But the idea somehow that lands with people in a way that makes it aspirational, David. It's a weird thing.
Yeah.
We salute the rich in this culture. So you almost can't be filthy rich enough.
Right. Well, listen, I'm in favor of people making money and doing things. Mike Bloomberg made money by creating a product that turned out to have tremendous need and taking the business that had been held by Dow Jones and Reuters and Knight Ridder and showing there was a much better way to do it. Now, the money came from the people who were ripping off the country on Wall Street, but he himself is a perfect example of a guy who built a better mousetrap. So, I'm glad you got your money. I think you should have to pay a lot more in taxes, but I'm glad you got your money.
Thank you, though. But that's the key. I have nothing against. I don't even have anything against a billionaire. It's just that I'd like to see you pay something back into the society that enabled that life.
But there's a philosophical problem here. Remember, Martin Luther King in the 1963 march said, I want my 4 little children to grow up and live in a world where they'll be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And, Mark, we have created a society where we are judging people by the content of their wallet, or in Trump's case, what he claims is in his wallet. Money is no measure of character. Wisdom and virtue are what we should be measuring people by. It is certainly what the founders of this country thought. You know, they were a wide range of people. There were drunks, there were intellectuals, there were farmers, there were manufacturers, but all of them shared a fundamental belief that this was about virtue and wisdom, not about getting rich. Now, maybe that's because they were generally the richest people in the country,
Right.
But that's got to be something we need to restore, wisdom and virtue. And nobody can look at Donald Trump and think for 1 second that the man has wisdom or virtue.
No, and I think if Bloomberg had a shred of charisma, we'd be having a different conversation about the Democratic field today, too, that he could have bought his way a lot farther.
I think you're right about that, and I think the same thing is true of Elizabeth Warren, who is – I've known Elizabeth almost as long as I've known Donald. I've known her about 30 years. She is a very serious, dedicated person with a solid track record.
Yeah, the smartest person on the stage.
She just comes off as grandma saying you got to eat your vegetables.
Yeah, no,
That's it. I mean, it's sorry,
she has a third grade teacher quality, and she brings empathy to a sociopath fight too. You know.
Yes, and of course, there's no sexism or misogyny in America, so there's no
of
need
course
to discuss
not.
that.
That's beyond.
Right?
That's besides the point.
So tough for all these women. I feel so, they have to work so much harder just to get to the same spot as the guys. Clearly, she's, I thought, in Elizabeth Warren, the most capable of actually shaping her strategies into legislation in Washington, into working the system, But again, she sits on the sidelines. Before I let you go, I do want to ask you, by the time this airs, the primaries, of course, will have been resolved this Tuesday. But it was a Bernie-Joe very close as we record this now. And now the primaries are going down in Michigan and all those. How do you handicap this entire thing? Biden is such a mainstream candidate. I mean, to any progressive, he's virtually a Republican. But that said, where do you see this race continuing? Well,
we've never elected anyone who's anywhere near Bernie. Now, maybe we're going in the direction where that will happen, but look at the past history of people who ran. The socialists had their best election in 1912, and there were 4 candidates, including the Bull Moose Party of Theodore Roosevelt. And just as a practical matter, I just can't see Bernie winning. And remember, this election is not about the popular vote, Mark. Donald's going to lose by a minimum of 12 million votes. He lost the last time by 11 million if you count the minor party candidates.
Oh, okay.
But I think he's going to lose by 12 million votes in the popular election. I think the data we've seen so far supports that. The issue is you got to win the Electoral College. And I've spent a lot of time in the Midwest. I've been to 66 of the 99 counties in Iowa, and I've never covered a campaign. I've been there for other reasons. And I just can't see the people who live in the heartland, that I live right on the edge of it in Rochester, New York, voting for Bernie Sanders for president, no matter how much they may dislike Donald Trump. And I could be wrong. I could be absolutely wrong. Could be that we're ready.
And in a nutshell, the reason being...
Because he's seen as someone who is against private property and, speaks so well of Castro and the Russians in the Soviet era. And, Bernie is a great rabble-rouser. I mean, I admire Bernie as a rabble-rouser. He doesn't talk to me anymore since I pointed out his wife committed bank fraud and then wasn't indicted for it, which is understandable, right?
You'll give him a pass on that?
Yeah, but Biden is Biden the best choice the Democrats had? Nah.
No.
I think that's pretty clear. He is, I think, seen by a lot of people, though, as the sort of safe choice. It's going to matter in his case, which it usually doesn't, who he picks as vice president, because he's probably going to serve only one term. And American public will decide what they're going to decide, but it's not the popular vote that matters here. It's the Electoral College. It's Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and Arizona. Those are the states that are going to matter.
Wow.
And, we'll see. I mean, the one thing about the great American experiment in self-governance that was such a radical idea in 1789 is we determine our destiny.
Yeah, that's what scares me.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. DCReport.org for some great stuff. Great investigative stuff, great takes on things. and then just go back and crack any one of these books anywhere. The latest book from Cay Johnston is It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. And The Making of Donald Trump is a page turner too, and you can do a needle drop on that. Again, just crack it anywhere, and there's a great story. And I got to get into more of your stuff. You know, I feel like I know you and don't know you, Cay Johnston. I just really have such a great regard for you. So thank you so much for spending time with us.
Well, thank you, Mark and Josh. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So you'll come back on the San Francisco show again soon, and hopefully be a visitor here as well once again sometime soon.
Always love to talk to people from the town I was born in. So take care.
So cool. See you, man. So long.
You're listening to The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Well, he's part of the team that won the Pulitzer for the Washington Post with their reporting around the Trump administration, the Russia investigation, and this book by Phillip Rucker and Carol Leonnig, A Very Stable Genius, so well researched, so much journalism went into this, details what is going on in the Trump administration. It really pulls back the curtain on private meetings and conversations and briefings and attempted briefings and strategic meetings, none of which would have come to light had there not been so much journalism behind it. Phillip Rucker, it's really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Glad to talk with you.
I'm going to be like one of those guys at a classic rock show with a group playing wants to play some of the new stuff, and I'm going to be yelling at the back going, play your hits, play your hits. By that, I mean, you've got some great stories in this book. And so I want to have a general conversation, but I also wonder if we could visit a few of those stories along the way. They're so well researched and so well documented, and some of them are shocking.
Well, thank you. And of course, I'd love to talk about some of those stories. There are so many in the book, and Carol and I really came across a bounty of sort of new information and new episodes in our deep reporting for the book.
The book is A Very Stable Genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America. And again, you did it with Carol Leonnig. She's also a Post reporter, right?
That's right. She's an investigative reporter at the Washington Post.
I think you unplugged sort of from daily journalism work to work on this book. I mean, it's so well researched, that would seem to almost have to be the case.
Yeah, so we've been covering the Trump story for 3 years now, from the beginning of the administration, and in fact, I covered his campaign for the 2 years prior to that. And the sort of onslaught of news, the crises hour after hour, day after day, became dizzying for us. And so what we wanted to do was hit the pause button and try to go back and really understand what happened in these important moments of history. We knew we were living through history, but we weren't able to make sense of it. And we wanted to do this deeper reporting that really helps identify some patterns of behavior of the president, and we think helps, the American people really understand what's gone on as well.
When you were covering the Trump campaign, did you have a sense that this guy actually may win?
Absolutely. I knew the odds were against him, and I recognized that Hillary Clinton, appeared to be in a better position to win because of all of the sort of gravitational advantages that we thought she had in that campaign. But I went to enough of those Trump rallies to know that there was an intensity behind his support, and that there were a lot of people in the country, tens of millions of people in the country who liked what he was saying, who saw him as their champion, and who were likely to turn out to vote for him. And so I knew it was very possible that he could win the presidency.
Is this speaking to maybe the Washington part of this? And you are in Washington. I mean, that's the Washington Post beat there. How is it that was missed by so much of the punditry out of Washington?
Well, I don't know that it was completely missed, but covering politics for a long time in Washington, there are certain sort of rules and norms and traditions in political campaigns, and by all of those measures, Hillary Clinton had the advantage. Of course, Trump proved her wrong, and there were. And she came close, of course. She actually won 3 million more votes in the popular vote and lost very narrowly in a few states, which ended up losing the Electoral College for her. But being out on the road with Trump, you saw something different, and you could tell that he was resonating with his supporters in a unique and profound way.
So when you and Carol Leonnig unplug, as you say, or hit the pause button and you start researching this, I'm going to ask you a little bit about process, and then I want to get to a story from the book.
Yeah.
What was the process? Did you each have a beat within the overall beat? Or, how do you do such a comprehensive job? And this book is over 400 pages. How do you do such a comprehensive job on this administration as a team?
Well, Carol and I cover different aspects of the presidency. I'm our White House bureau chief at the Post and cover the day-to-day news and goings-on at the White House. The president, I travel with him around the world. I write about what he's doing, the decisions he's making, and so forth. Carol's an investigative reporter on the national staff, and for these past few years has really focused on covering the president, his lawyers, the Russia investigation, various crises that have emerged within the administration, the White House counsel's office, for example. And so we're a neat pairing in that we came to the table with different backgrounds, different experiences, different sources, and different understandings of the Trump presidency, and we combined forces to do this book. And the process was extensive. We interviewed more than 200 senior administration officials and friends and other confidants and advisors of the president to try to get a complete accounting of these 3 years, and obviously to verify the stories that we're hearing and feel like what we're presenting in the narrative of the book is the complete truth as best we could determine it.
It is a rigorous job of reporting and a rigorous job of journalism that you've done here. A very stable genius was what he called himself, right?
That's right. This is Trump's own phrase. He actually used it for the first time in January of 2018. There was a conversation underway around the country then about his psychological health and mental acuity, his fitness to be president, and Trump took to Twitter to defend himself and said, I was a successful businessman, and I'm paraphrasing here, I was a successful reality television star, and then I got elected president on my first try. That makes me a genius. In fact, it makes me a very stable genius. And then that's a phrase Trump used at least 4 additional times, including on some overseas trips when he was at summits with our allies. And Carol and I selected it for the title of the book because we saw this book not only as a history of these years, but as a character study, a portrait of the president himself. And so we wanted to use the president's own words in the title and hold up that self-definition almost as a mirror onto himself to really study his conduct, his behavior, and stress test it against the accounts of so many of the people who worked for him.
Yeah, one of the things that's so revealing is how shallow Donald Trump is, with really no intellectual curiosity whatsoever. You have, I think, maybe one of the most celebrated conversations that his advisors tried to have with Trump in the tank, as it was called. Can you take us through that? Because I think it was really so revealing. It speaks to the fact that he feels as though he has everything he needs already, is what I kind of got from it.
Yeah, this was such an important and indelible moment in the first year of the presidency. It was July of 2017, 6 months in, and the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Gary Cohn, the National Economic Council Director, they were concerned with the president's lack of knowledge about world affairs, about military deployments. And so they decided to convene a tutorial session for several hours. They brought the president to a room called the Tank inside the Pentagon. It's a sacred space, a sanctum, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff meet to decide matters of war and peace. And they went through a slideshow presentation with the president. They tried to teach him about, where U.S. troops are deployed. Why do we have bases around the world? Why do we have so many military personnel on the Korean Peninsula, for example? Why are we part of the NATO alliance? And what is the value of the NATO alliance?
But they had meticulously, isn't it right, Philip? They had meticulously planned this presentation for Donald Trump. In other words, they knew.
Did.
I thought that was the interesting thing about it.
They did, and in fact, they tried to put his name on as many of the slides as possible. They tried to talk in terms of dollars and cents because as a real estate guy, Trump responded to figures of money much more than other pieces of information. But Trump got bored and irritated with the tutorial nature of the session, and he started snapping and bellowing and barking at the generals and the others in the room. And he said, "You're a bunch of dopes and babies." He said the war in Afghanistan was a loser war. And then he said something that really stuck with people. He said, "I wouldn't go to war with you people." And for the commander-in-chief to say that, it was the most harrowing, offensive, disrespectful thing for people who wear our country's uniform to hear. But they heard it, and nobody stood up to him other than Rex Tillerson, who challenged him and scolded him for having disrespected the soldiers. And when the meeting concluded, Tillerson told some others in a hallway that the president was an effing moron.
Yeah, that was really his undoing because that word got out.
It was. A few months later, it leaked out first in NBC News, and by the spring of the next year, Tillerson was fired by the president. But that tank briefing is what really damaged their relationship forever.
That tank briefing also, as I say, reflects so much that we now know about Donald Trump, and that he doesn't like these briefings. He doesn't want to be educated. Meaning he doesn't want the feel of being educated, as though somebody knows more about something than he does. At least that's what I was getting from it. Isn't that sort of the vibe?
That's exactly right. He has a belief in his own knowledge, his own intelligence. He thinks he knows more than his briefers. He thinks he knows more about any given subject than the experts that are hired by the government to study those subjects. And it's a supreme confidence that many of his advisors told Carol and me is completely misplaced. In fact, they were shocked at the gaps in the president's knowledge, including about American history. For example, the president did his first trip to Asia and stopped off in Hawaii and paid a visit to the USS Arizona Memorial. That's the Pearl Harbor Memorial. And as he was setting out into the water, he turned to his chief of staff, John Kelly, and said, "John, what is this all about?" He had heard of Pearl Harbor. He knew it was the scene of a battle, but he just didn't really understand what happened there or what the historical significance was.
I mean, it's really stunning because I can't imagine growing up in America, which is the place that Donald Trump did grow up, and not know that. I mean, it's just such a basic thing, especially of his age. I mean, if it were, I don't know, somebody Pete Buttigieg's age and he was sort of the Donald Trump 4.0, maybe I could see it, but I don't understand it. I mean, it's a disconnect that would suggest, I don't know, an insular life or something. I don't mean to read too much into it. I find that astounding on its face.
Yeah, and it wasn't that he hadn't heard of Pearl Harbor. He had heard of Pearl Harbor. He just didn't know what happened there. He didn't understand why it was such a significant scene in our nation's history. He didn't know that was where the Japanese attacked us with the surprise attack that then propelled us into World War II and rechanged the world order from that point forward. He didn't understand history, and it's because he doesn't care to read history or study it. He thinks mostly about himself.
In the Michael Lewis book, The Fifth Risk, it was scary how ill-prepared Donald Trump and his people were also for ascendants to actually govern. They left a lot of offices completely vacant. There's more than a whiff of that in your book.
Yeah, it was a very haphazard planning period. There was a 10-week transition between the election and the inauguration in January of 2017. Trump, of course, did not anticipate winning, so had done very little preparation or even any thought about how to assemble a government. Chris Christie, the New Jersey governor, had done a lot of thought into this. He was the transition chairman, but then he was fired right after the election by Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor. So the president, in assembling his cabinet, was trying to do central casting. He wanted people who looked the part on TV. He loves the idea of Nikki Haley at the United Nations because she's multi-ethnic and seemed to have an international flair to him. He loved the idea of Jim Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, the Marine Corps general, as defense secretary because he resembled George Patton in the president's eyes. He did the central casting hiring, but then didn't pay careful attention to vetting candidates or checking their backgrounds, and it's one of the reasons he ended up with Michael Flynn as the national security advisor, which proved to be a pretty grave error.
And of course, he was warned off, Michael Flynn, by the Obama people, wasn't he?
He was warned off about Flynn by Obama himself, as well as by Chris Christie, who said, Flynn's going to get you into trouble. I would not hire him. And Trump ignored that advice. He did hire Flynn. And of course, it only took a few weeks before Flynn got himself and the president in a heap of trouble.
Well, just on the transition, and then I want to get back to not so much Flynn, but Russia and then the Russia investigation. Just on the transition, it's worth noting that there's more than just appointing cabinet officials to a transition. There are huge government agencies that have to be staffed. There have to be decisions made. And there are entire arms of the transition team that are dedicated to that on both sides, meaning in government as well. They want to brief the new people coming in. It's supposed to make for what is a smooth transition. But that didn't happen.
It didn't. And part of the challenge for Trump in assembling the government is he had so little trust in traditional public servants and experts in the field. He wanted everybody to prove personal loyalty to him, not loyalty to the country, but loyalty to Donald Trump, the man, the president, the boss. And it's hard to find enough people to fill those jobs who are going to meet that standard. And the president had such little respect for or trust in the intelligence experts, the national security experts throughout the government. He viewed them as conspiring against them. He viewed them as dangerous. He didn't want to take briefings from them. He didn't want to promote them in the government, and it really held back the process of assembling not only the cabinet, but these agencies, as you point out.
What is the Donald Trump disposition toward briefings? I know that early on there are these big briefing books, which was sort of the way past presidents got their information, but that quickly went away. What happened?
Well, the problem is that Trump didn't want to read the briefings. So initially they were bringing him briefing books the way they had for past presidents, and he wasn't reading them. Then they boiled it all down to 3-page briefing materials, but that was too long to keep his attention. Then they brought him single-page briefings, and he still wouldn't read those. And so then they started giving him kind of oral briefings based on just bullet points on note cards. And he paid somewhat attention to that he really preferred graphics and videos and pictures, not a reader. But he also didn't want to consume the information in other ways. He just didn't have a high tolerance for being guided or schooled by so-called experts. He believed that he had the knowledge himself and that he would make the best gut decisions irrespective of the details or the information that some of these national security figures were supposed to be bringing to him.
Phillip Rucker, it seems as though Trump's ingestion of Fox News, that really is the daily briefing for him.
It certainly is part of the daily briefing, and it's not just Fox News. He pays very close attention across the media. He, certainly watches Fox and Friends in the morning from the residence, but he also watches MSNBC and CNN, and he flips through the morning newspapers. He cares a lot about the way he himself is covered in the media. He reads the stories and the headlines that have his name and are about him. And frankly, what we've seen over these 3 years is people who want to be able to influence the president's thinking, who want to communicate a message to the president, often try to do so through the media, either through quotes in a story or appearances on some of the TV shows that they know he watches. And, he spends a lot of time consuming media. He doesn't arrive in the Oval Office until about 11 a.m. or sometimes even later in the day. And all of those morning hours are spent in what his schedulers call executive time, but it's really time for him alone in the residence to be watching TV, tweeting, calling friends, just informally sort of going about his business.
Just to the point about Fox News and getting on Fox News or being on Fox News or getting FaceTime there, making a difference. I'm thinking of the Rod Blagojevich pardon, or I guess commutation.
Oh, yeah.
And that was really led by his wife, who was a frequent visitor to Fox News.
She was. And, we've seen that pattern again and again. Matthew Gallagher got the president's attention through Fox News as well. And there's a scene in the book where, the president actually reversed a decision that his White House was actively on Capitol Hill that morning trying to enforce, which was the president's backing of an important national security surveillance bill. But the president was swayed by commentary from Andrew Napolitano on Fox and Friends that morning and tweeted out his opposition to the bill. And it created for a few hours a genuine moment of chaos and dysfunction within the Republican Party among the leadership in Congress trying to pass this bill at the White House's direction, and the president himself tweeting from the residence his opposition because he was so moved by something that a television commentator had said.
Now to the Russia part of the Trump administration, because you point out that very early on, Donald Trump had an interest in meeting with Putin and some kind of connection to the Russians.
That's right. We report in the book that during the transition phase in late 2016, as Trump was interviewing one of the candidates to become Secretary of State, he interrupted the conversation to ask Reince Priebus, who was also in the room and slated to become the chief of staff at the White House. He asked Priebus, "When can I meet Putin?" He wanted to meet President Putin face-to-face in person. He asked if he could do that meeting before the inauguration. Priebus had to explain to the president that would be inappropriate, and for a couple reasons. One, we only have one president at a time in America, and until Trump was sworn in, the president was Barack Obama, and it would therefore not be appropriate for the president-elect to be having world leader meetings until he takes office. But two, he really had an obligation to meet first with the heads of the countries that make up the NATO alliance the UK, Germany, France, some of our more trusted Western democratic allies before currying favor with the Russian president.
It's sort of transition 101. I mean, that's really sort of boilerplate. And yet, again, it had to be explained to Trump, who was desperate to meet with Putin.
Yeah, but it underscores Trump's fascination with Putin that has been a through line throughout the presidency and even predated the presidency. Trump has long admired Putin's leadership in Russia, his strength as a leader, the way in which he has almost complete control over his country, over law enforcement. He suppresses his political opposition, and those are all qualities that Trump admires in a political leader. Of course, our political system is different than that in Russia, and we don't have authoritarian presidents in the United States. But there's a lot that Trump admires in Putin, and he was fixated on meeting Putin, and he, of course, eventually did for the first time in Germany in 2017, and then again at that summit that we all remember in Helsinki, when Trump took Putin at his word that Russia did not interfere in the election, despite the conclusions and the definitive evidence presented by the U.S. intelligence agencies.
And I do want to get to the Russia investigation and Mueller, because you have great detail about that. I also just, though, while we're on Russia, want to talk about what happened early on and how it became something that, just as a citizen, I was really troubled by. I'm talking about the meeting in the Oval Office that he had with Russian photographer. Help me, Philip. Who are the characters there in that meeting?
It was early on, and it was a meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, as well as Ambassador Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the U.S. He invited them into the Oval Office to meet with them. He also invited, or allowed rather, a Russian state media photographer from TASS to attend and to document the meeting. And that was where Trump revealed classified information. And I forget the exact details of the raid, but about a military situation in the Middle East. He revealed sensitive classified materials about the operation to the Russians, which was considered a real breach of protocol and jeopardizing national security.
And sure, and it was almost done in kind of, as I recall, it was as though he was just bragging about the information he had. At least that's the way it was depicted.
That's right, and that's been a thread, a characteristic throughout the presidency, where he has shown very little. He's not a particularly scrupulous individual, so he has shown little care with intelligence. He doesn't really distinguish necessarily between the things that he's supposed to keep secret and the things that he can talk about freely with others or to brag about. And we've documented in the book several instances where his advisors were hesitant to tell him the full details or to bring him the most sensitive of the nation's secrets because they were worried he might have loose lips and brag about them in public or bring them up at a rally or even tweet about them.
Well, he has disdain for the intelligence. He has disdain, it would seem, for the intelligence community, save those who are true Trump loyalists.
He certainly does, but it's important to, understand where that disdain comes from. He had his first real exposure to the nation's intelligence chiefs in early January of 2017, a couple weeks before he took office as president. And they came to him to brief him on the investigation into Russia's election interference. But then Comey, the FBI director, stayed behind and told him about this dossier with salacious allegations involving Trump. It really caught Trump off guard. He felt very much under siege by the intelligence chiefs. And from that point forward, concluded that he couldn't trust them, that they were not on his team, not going to protect him, and really feared and viewed conspiracies in what they were doing. I mean, it's that has continued for 3 years, but there is an origin to his views about it, and it's because of that meeting that took place at Trump Tower.
You have a line in your book: two kinds of people went to work for the administration, those who thought Trump was saving the world and those who thought the world needed to be saved from Trump. First of all, that's just great writing. I don't know. It summarizes in an essential sentence the situation there, because there were those close to Trump who felt they were doing the work of the nation by keeping him from touching a lot of things that he otherwise would have touched.
Yeah, they saw themselves as protector of America's institutions, protectors of the alliances, protectors of our democracy. And, you know, they wanted the president to succeed. That's why they went to work for him. They hoped this would be a successful presidency, but they were not Trump loyalists necessarily. They were not going to just do anything he wanted done. And in fact, they saw themselves as guardrails against what they considered to be some of his more dangerous impulses and instincts. Now, most of those people are now gone. That I would put in that category Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, John Kelly, the chief of staff at the White House, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, all gone. And in their place now in year 3 of the presidency, going on year 4, are enablers. You have a Secretary of State in Mike Pompeo, who wants to help execute what the president wants done, who tolerated Rudy Giuliani functioning as a shadow diplomat with Ukraine. You have an acting White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, who sees himself, and proudly so, as something of a yes man, of finding ways to execute the president's orders, including but not limited to withholding that foreign aid from Ukraine. And so it's really an axis of enablers right now, and it speaks to the president's confidence in exercising his power and his intolerance for any kind of dissent or betrayal or lack of loyalty.
Many of these stories and many of these details come through these conversations, multiple sources and this kind of thing, but these conversations with people who don't want to go on the record, meaning with their names, for obvious reasons. I mean, this president who really goes on these jihads against people who, A, testify before Congress against him, or who utter anything that he views as in the least bit negative. So I can understand why they'd stay quiet. But here's my question. You also really get to a lot of these military people. I mean, that's suggested anyway, because a lot of these conversations relate to conversations with generals or conversations with people who are high up in the military chain. You did have those conversations, didn't you?
Well, we're not going to reveal our sources. You know, most of the people we spoke to gather information for this book did so on the condition of anonymity because they trusted us as reporters. They feared speaking on the record because they feared the president's retaliation. They didn't want to have the president and his allies coming after them. Some of them are still in the government. Many of them are still in the government. So we're going to be careful in how we describe those sources. But I will say that among our 200 sources for this book are many firsthand witnesses and senior officials with firsthand intimate interactions with the president.
Yeah, and I don't mean to obsess on that, but I thought that tank moment that you talk about and that you describe so vividly really spoke to how the military didn't dare say anything. Those members of the military didn't dare say anything to Trump. And it was only Tillerson who felt that he could. In other words, you saw the chain of command and how it works in Donald Trump's favor as president.
Yeah, and there's a moment in that tank scene where Tillerson is thinking to himself, and he told other people about this after the fact, which is how we ended up finding out he thought this. But he looked across the table at Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, and thought, gosh darn it, Jim, why don't you stand up and say something and defend the troops? And then he realized, you know what, Mattis is genetically a Marine, and Marines respect the chain of command, and Trump is the commander-in-chief, and so Mattis, as the defense secretary, can't challenge him. And there was a similar silence, although even more puzzling, from Vice President Pence, who was described to us as something of a wax museum figure. He just sat there silently as Trump railed against those who wear the uniform and even called the war in Afghanistan a loser war. Well, Pence's son, Michael, is in the military and did serve in Afghanistan. And clearly the vice president does not view the war in Afghanistan as a loser war. He would never think of his son as a loser. And yet he refused to stand up to or confront the president in that moment.
Yeah, Mike Pence is an interesting case study in himself for another time. I don't want to let you go without getting to the Russia investigation because, indeed, Trump was obsessed with it, and it involved all of these tentacles of the Justice Department and Robert Mueller, et cetera. Can you just, in the Cliff Notes version, take us through some of that?
Yeah, so the Russia investigation is a through line throughout the narrative of A Very Stable Genius, and we go behind the scenes with the president and his lawyers plotting their various strategies and how to protect the president from having to sit for an interview with Bob Mueller. But I would say the climax of our reporting on the Russia investigation comes near the end, when Mueller is drawing his final conclusions, deciding not to subpoena the president. There were tense discussions inside the special counsel's office, which had been sort of a bunker where no secrets were emerging from, but we fortunately were able to learn some new reporting about those decisions. Real discomfort with Mueller's decision not to subpoena the president for an interview, not to charge him with obstruction of justice, even though it was so well documented in Volume 2 of his report, and then real clashing between Mueller and Attorney General Bill Barr over the final rollout of the report. Remember, Mueller submitted that report to Barr, but there was about a month before Barr released it to the public, and all the public knew was a 4-page summary conclusions letter that Barr drafted, which Mueller believed was highly misleading and not transparent or representative of the true findings of the report. But it turned out to be a brilliant public relations move in defense of the president, because it helped convince the public that the Mueller report didn't find anything on the president, even though that's not true.
Exactly. It seized the narrative, didn't it? And you go through all of that so carefully in a detailed way. And you even talk about the fact, and I thought this was really a great point. I think you have a quote from somebody making the point that in today's media culture, you need to punch through.
Exactly.
And yeah, the Mueller report didn't punch through because there was no person or there was no one repping it in that way that is reflecting a contemporary media culture.
Exactly. And not just a contemporary media culture, but the Trump era, where the president himself was using every public platform at his disposal, including Twitter, to day after day, in some cases multiple times a day, claim that he was exonerated completely, that the report found nothing, that Mueller was biased, that there was total and complete vindication. Those things are not true, and yet there was no capable attempt by Mueller to defend the integrity of his investigation or his report. And we have some analysis in the book, including by people who served under Mueller, who ended up concluding that Mueller failed the country in that moment because he let the president and he let the attorney general get away with defining the narrative of this report in a dishonest way.
And you also note a moment at which, isn't it Barr who looks at Mueller and where Mueller's hands are shaking? Is that? Yeah.
They were meeting in the Attorney General's conference room, I believe. It was the first meeting that Mueller had with Barr after Barr became the Attorney General, and Mueller picked up a piece of paper to read his opening remarks. He had kind of scripted what he wanted to say at the top of the meeting, and as he's holding the paper, his hands were shaking, and he had trouble getting his words out completely, and then his deputy, Aaron Zebley, stepped in and kind of did most of the talking for the rest of the meeting. But after the meeting concluded, Barr and the other senior officials at the Justice Department who were around the table said to each other, boy, that's not the Bob Mueller we know. Something's not right here. That's not the Mueller we all remember, being the incredible and celebrated FBI director for so many years.
And that's such a key thing as that entire...
And we, of course, all saw that when Mueller testified before Congress a few months later.
Exactly. Just because we're on the Mueller, there was a real effort on the part of the Trump team to keep him away from any kind of back and forth with the Mueller people. They wanted to interview the president, and his lawyers were saying, no. They had to kind of get him surrounded to make sure that he didn't.
That's right. For months, the big question over this investigation was whether Mueller would sit down with the president for an interview. It was something that Mueller felt he needed to do. The special counsel team believed that there were certain questions outstanding that only the president could answer. And the president was interested in talking to Mueller in an interview because he had such faith in his ability, his charisma, and his way with words to be able to persuade Mueller of his innocence. But the president's lawyers knew better. They knew that the president oftentimes exaggerates or says things that are not true, and that if he were to sit down for an interview interview with Mueller, it would almost certainly result in perjury, because it was very likely that the president would say something, either intentional or not, that was a lie, that was not true, and that Mueller could catch him on it. So that the lawyers went to elaborate lengths to protect the president, to prevent him from doing an interview. We report in the book that there was actually an interview scheduled at Camp David, I believe in January of 2018, and was canceled at the last minute because of an intervention by the president's lawyers. But the Marine One helicopter departure had already been planned. Everything was ready to go for that interview. There was even a plan to get Mueller and his deputies whisked onto the grounds of Camp David in private without being detected by the media, but they pulled the plug on that because, again, the president's lawyers did not have faith in his ability to answer questions truthfully.
And the one thing that comes across is that Trump himself is a very strong figure who stands up against advice and the wishes of his closest advisors. That always
again and again. Correct.
Because he is so very impulsive, and he is unfortunately dealing with really just gut instinct and what he's seen on television. It makes us as Americans that much more concerned as to what might happen.
Yeah, well, he certainly over these 3 years has grown even more comfortable standing up and defying his advisors and his aides and basically forcing his will. And part of that is because he's more confident in how the government works and how to exercise his own power. So what we have now is really a presidency of one, where he makes decisions, he does what he wants, he finds people around him to execute it, and if anyone's unwilling to follow those orders, they're gone, and he gets somebody else in place. Of course there are exceptions, but he is increasingly empowered and emboldened as the months go on, and especially in these weeks following the impeachment, the acquittal in the impeachment trial.
Well, it's a page-turner, Phillip Rucker. It really is. A very stable genius. And I've only touched on things, didn't even touch on the entire border controversy with Kirstjen Nielsen and all that. I mean, there is what a maelstrom of stuff went on in this first 3 years and continues to go on.
There's a lot there, and every page is a new thing that happened. So I'm so glad that you found it interesting and riveting, and it was nice to spend time talking with you about it.
Really enjoyed it. A very stable genius. Donald J. Trump's Testing of America from Phillip Rucker and Carol Leonnig. Phillip, we hope that you'll visit with us again. Thanks again.
Thanks. Glad to.
Well, that's it for this episode. I try to give you a big fat episode to chew on. I know there's a lot of content now. It seems as though a lot of people are doing podcasts now because they're inside with nothing to do, and good for them. But I hope there's something through the weeks that you can take from our stuff, and we will provide more content, as I say, in the days ahead. Hey, stay healthy, will you please? You can reach us at edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. And until next time, be well and bye-bye.